Assessment really is the work that we rely upon you to do, and it is some of the most important work that we do at this college. Indeed, beyond providing the educational experience for our students, being able to measure how well students learn and to use that information to improve teaching and learning is the most important work that a faculty group can do together. And it does take us all together because it is something that's very important not only to our students but to the future of our college. I thought we'd start by thinking a little bit about assessment. In terms of the fact that it's not necessarily an end point, but rather it's cyclical. It's an ongoing process. You might, in a sense, say, this is what our moms meant when they said, look before you leap, or think before you act. So assessment isn't really the end work, it's oftentimes the beginning work. So let's talk about who does assessment and why we think they do it. First thought that came to my mind was medical doctors and nurses. When a patient comes to see them, before they go and make a prognosis, before they go and sign a prescription for the person or take them off to the hospital, they need to diagnose and find out where there's an opportunity to improve the health condition that they're seeing at the beginning. In other words, assessment at the beginning is absolutely critical. Knowing where we start and then being able to make decisions from that point. I also thought about new home buyers. Very few of us will buy a home, and in fact, sometimes it's actually legally required of us that we have a home assessment. So again, what's the point of departure? What are we willing to bring to this house to improve it, to make it the house that will be the place that we want to live in and raise our family? What are the improvements that we can bring along the way so that investment actually pays off down the line? Assessment is every step of the way, but it also begins at that beginning. I think in terms of a military general. Before I send folks off into battle, I need to assess the situation. I need to know the current conditions. I need to see what my options are. I need to see where the blockades might be, where I may need to send in reinforcements, and where what I assume might actually be disastrous. I need to know rather than just assume. And finally, no one starts a new business without doing critical assessment of what the competition is out there, where we could start, what would make us different, and in the end of the day, what's going to be the return on our investment. Now that's a lot of business talk perhaps, and we don't like that analogy sometimes in the academy, but what we do love is an end result that says students leave us much better off than they were when they started it. When we think about it, it's not really much to say about education if we say we've prepared students to make a living. It is a lot to say about education if we say we've prepared students to live a life. And that's what I think we're all doing today. That's how high the stakes really are, and that's why assessment is really very much important. So I've talked about it in terms of being cyclical, not something that we just do at the end of processes, but things that we want to do in an ongoing fashion. Let's take a look at that for just a second. As we kind of saw in the examples that I gave, assessing the current state of affairs, knowing where you're at the point of departure, is very important work. Many of us already have that point of departure understood. We've been measuring the success of our students for some time now. But real assessment takes a look at that and says, what can I learn from this? What is the pathway forwards? And where are the opportunities for improvement? That's the piece that many of us in the academy are failing to do. We measure, we stash the data away, rather than saying I can use that data now to plan and to perhaps move things forwards. When we think of opportunities for improvement, or possibly even needs for change, that should be based on what we have learned again from assessment. When we look at assessment, it's not what's right, what's wrong, it's where can we improve. That's what makes the great difference between simply teaching and instilling an understanding of how learning is an ongoing life achievement for our students. Strategic planning, implementation, in other words, action. it almost makes no sense to take action if you can't base it upon the assessment that you've done first to actually have strategized what actions you're going to take. And of course, here we get to the part of assessment that I think we all get. It is about measuring that success. There's the cycle of assessment. What can we do at the beginning to find out where our students start? What do we do along the way to make sure that they're keeping up with us and that they're learning what we think that we're teaching? And then how at the end do we measure what it is that they have learned and see how we can improve our process and our part in that? I want to share with you a quote from Dylan William. He is a British educator. Back in 1998 caused a bit of a stir with a book called Inside the Black Box. And that does make us a little bit nervous because it sounds like people coming into our classroom and seeing what we're doing and evaluating us. Let me state categorically that assessment and evaluation are two separate, completely different enterprises. And what we've been talking about and what we've been doing almost exclusively here through CASEL and through all of the work of the faculty in this room has been assessment. Not evaluating faculty members, but learning what we learn about the learning that the students are doing, and then using that to improve our teaching. This is what Dylan said. When a teacher teaches, no matter how well he or she might design a lesson, what a student learns is unpredictable. Students do not always learn what we teach. That is why the most important assessment does not happen at the end of learning. It happens during the learning when there is still time to do something with the information. So let's think about assessing learning on three different levels. Part of what Dylan's talking about is the opportunity to do assessment in the actual course of a course. In other words, while we're doing the teaching itself. Can we do course assessment on a daily basis? Absolutely. Does it need to take a lot of time and steal away from our content delivery or the hands-on experiential learning that our students do? Not at all. It could be a 1-minute paper. It could be a student filling out an index card. This is what I thought the most important point was today. It could simply be a one-question quiz. It may or may not even count for a grade, but it gives us information before the student leaves the classroom as to whether or not they grasped what we thought we were really teaching. And it gives us the chance to readjust or right-size or reposition before the students leave the class or first thing when they come back in the class following. Course assessment, however, goes all the way through to see that the students have been able to demonstrate, master, and show their competency in the student learning outcomes around which the course was built. All of this is work that faculty members have done sometimes years before you're actually teaching the class. The student learning outcomes don't necessarily change year after year after year. But again, as Dylan says, what students learn and what we think we taught are two different things. Also, we have to be very, very sure that we're taking account to the fact that as students change learning styles, as students take their courses through different delivery methods, online, hybrid, face-to-face, as perhaps 21 different adjunct or full-time faculty members teach different sections of the same course, we are still required to demonstrate that the measurement of the student learning outcomes, the objectives, and the way that we go about helping our students to achieve them is consistent and is adequately being addressed at all levels and in all conditions. That is actually the Higher Learning Commission's demand of us, and something that we need to be able to demonstrate. Course assessment can actually give us the tools that we need when linked together to determine how well students do in their preparation, their journey, and their completion of a program of study. In other words, a certificate, a degree. How do we know at the end of that journey that the student has mastered all that we need them to in order to begin a job or to be able to move on to the next tier of educational attainment at a 4-year transfer institution? One of the great ways to be able to do this is to use the guided pathways work that we've already done to see the course sequencing and to cross-reference the courses that students take with the learning objectives and the learning outcomes that have been established at the program level. So we know where students are introduced to important information, where they develop that learning, and where they demonstrate their mastery of that learning. You can think of it in terms almost of a grid, and being able, as like on a bingo card, to be able to place your tokens and be able to follow a path as a student introduces themselves to some knowledge, applies that knowledge, and then is ready to use that knowledge to demonstrate their readiness to receive a degree and or to continue their further education. Finally, program assessment is exactly what's necessary for us to be able to then turn around and say, what can the world expect of a Henry Ford Hawk? What is the special sauce of a degree coming out of Henry Ford College? What are those things that we hope every alumna, every alumnus is able to demonstrate by virtue of the fact that they came through and are now a part of our learning community as they become lifelong learners? To a certain extent, it means, have we defined our institutional learning outcomes? Do we know what they really mean? And are we able to actually measure whether or not students can demonstrate those competencies? Here at Henry Ford College, we took our general education learning outcomes and have positioned them as our institutional learning outcomes. So the work of some of you in this room who have been doing general education CASEL work, you have really been preparing us to get to this exciting moment where we can start to see, after a student has done 1, 2, 3, 4 semesters of work here, have they walked away with the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of skills that we hope that they would gain, not solely through their program of study, not solely through a collection of independent and perhaps not even interrelated courses, but in the mortar between those bricks from the experience that they've had at this college. That includes what happens in a classroom, and that includes the co-curricular experiences that they have outside of the classroom, whether that's through participation in sports, in the arts, in student clubs, in service learning, so many other ways that students can richly apply what it is that they've learned in meaningful ways through the co-curricular channels. We have been doing amazing work in all of these areas. Don't let this scare you. This is work that every college does, and everyone has its own story to tell. Think of assessment as really telling our story. I share one more quote on assessment really quickly, and maybe it's a little bit more of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but to a certain extent, I think it's really important that we realize that at many points along the way, this is what the educational and assessment experience feels like to our students. This is Fisher and Fry back in 2007, and they shared this in A Tale of Two Middle Schools. I'll ask the question. A few of you will answer for the entire class, and we'll all pretend that this is the same thing as learning. Just asking a question and having students answer the question is not doing assessment. Assessment is really getting to the depths of how students learn, what they learn, what they're able to do with that learning, and most important, what we are able to do with what they have learned. Thank you again so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules. Assessment is indeed the work of all of us, but it is a special province for faculty, especially because your expertise, your experience, and your deep knowledge of how students learn is exactly what's necessary to do meaningful assessment.